I was reviewing a stack of batch release records when my phone buzzed on the corner of my desk. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just after lunch. I remember because I'd brought a turkey sandwich from home and hadn't even finished it yet. The email was from HR, sent at 2:47 p.m. I read it twice, then a third time. The words didn't rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. Effective immediately. I set the phone face down on my desk and looked at the batch records in front of me. Lot number 4471, B. Expiration dating. I just finished verifying. I picked up my pen and set it back down. Then I pushed back from my desk, walked to the window, and stared at the parking lot for a long moment. 19 years. That's how long I'd been at Crestline Pharma. My name is Owen. I was a senior compliance officer at a mid-sized pharmaceutical manufacturer in Central Ohio. We made contract medications, mostly generics. Some specialty compounds for hospital networks and regional distributors across 12 states. Nothing glamorous. The kind of work that doesn't get talked about at dinner parties but keeps hospital formularies stocked and patients alive. I started at Crestline right out of graduate school. Biochemistry degree, then a master's in regulatory affairs. I came in as a documentation specialist, which meant I spent my first 2 years essentially organizing binders, but I learned every corner of that facility, every SOP, every deviation record, every warning letter that had ever come in from the FDA. Over time, I accumulated something most people in my field spend a career trying to build. I held our facility's DEA register and authorization, 3 separate schedules. I was the named responsible person on our FDA establishment registration. I held our State Board of Pharmacy facility permit and my individual capacity as the designated qualified person, and I was the primary signatory on our EPA hazardous waste generator permit for pharmaceutical disposal. Not all of it, but enough of it. The kind of enough that makes a facility either functional or not. My director at the time, a man named Frank, used to joke that if I ever got hit by a bus, the company would have to shut down for 6 months just to untangle the paperwork. I'd laugh it off, but he wasn't entirely wrong, and we both knew it. The thing about pharmaceutical compliance is that most of these credentials aren't corporate assets. They're tied to a specific individual who has demonstrated qualifications, passed background checks, and been approved by a federal or state agency. You can't just reassign them like a laptop or a parking space. When the person goes, the credential goes with them. And getting replacements approved isn't a 2-week process. It can take months, sometimes longer. Frank understood this. His predecessor understood this. For 19 years, everyone who sat above me understood this. At least well enough to not do anything reckless. And then Frank retired, and everything changed. The new VP of Operations came in last spring. I'll call him my new boss, because that's what he was, technically. He was 34 years old. He'd done 2 years at a biotech startup in Boston and 3 years at a consulting firm before landing here. He wore slim-fit suits to a manufacturing floor and talked about operational agility like it was oxygen. He also had no pharmaceutical manufacturing background. None. Not a single day in a regulated production environment. That first week, he scheduled a one-on-one with every department head. Mine lasted 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when he cut it short to take a call. He spent most of those 11 minutes glancing at his laptop screen while I tried to walk him through the compliance structure of the facility. When I mentioned the DEA registration renewal cycle, he nodded in a way that made clear he had no idea what I was talking about and wasn't planning to find out. Within a month, the reorganization started. He brought in 2 people from his consulting days. I'll call them the consultants because that's essentially what they still were even with their new titles. They were maybe 28, 29. Sharp, confident, completely fluent in frameworks and dashboards and process optimization language. They spent their first few weeks building slide decks. Very impressive slide decks. One of them pulled me aside one afternoon near the coffee station. She asked me, cheerfully, whether I thought the compliance function could be streamlined through automation. I told her that some parts of documentation workflow could probably be improved with the right software, but that the regulatory credential structure wasn't something you automate away. She nodded enthusiastically, wrote something in her notebook, and walked off. I found out later she'd written "resistance to modernization" in that notebook. A colleague of mine saw it during a meeting. The next few months had a particular texture to them. The kind where you can feel something being decided about you without being invited to the conversation. I walk past conference rooms and catch fragments, legacy processes, overhead reduction, right-sizing the compliance function. I kept doing my job. I kept files current, renewals on schedule, deviation investigations documented. I kept showing up. My closest colleague during all of this was a woman I'll call my coworker. She'd been at Crestline for 11 years, managed our QA documentation team, and had a sharper read on people than almost anyone I'd ever met. One evening in October, she stopped by my office on her way out. "They're going to do something," she said. "I don't know what yet, but I'd start getting your records in order." I told her I appreciated the heads up. I didn't tell her I'd already been thinking about it for weeks. Here's the thing about professional credentials in a regulated industry. Some of them belong to the company. Equipment certifications, facility-level permits tied to the physical address, those follow the building. But the ones tied to a named individual, the ones that require that specific person's background check, that specific person's attestation, that specific person's professional history to be approved, those belong to that person. And when that person leaves, voluntarily or otherwise, those authorizations don't automatically transfer. They don't stay at the address, they expire, or get reassigned through a formal application process that takes time and scrutiny. My DEA registration covered Schedule 2, 3, and IV controlled substances in our manufacturing workflow. Reassigning that to another person required a new application, a background investigation, and DEA approval, typically a 6 to 12-month process for a facility our size, sometimes longer if there were any complications. The FDA establishment registration named me as primary contact and qualified signatory for several submission categories. Changing that required updating the registration through the FDA portal and potentially triggering a review of our current product applications. The State Board of Pharmacy permit named me as the qualified person. Ohio law requires that role to be filled by a licensed pharmacist or a person with specifically approved qualifications. Getting a replacement approved took time. There was no automatic handoff. The EPA permit was perhaps the most quietly consequential of all, because pharmaceutical waste disposal operates on a tight regulatory calendar. Miss a reporting cycle, let a permit lapse, operate without a properly designated responsible person, and you're looking at violations that carry per-day civil penalties and potential facility-level consequences. I hadn't collected these credentials to be difficult. I'd collected them because someone had to hold them, and over 19 years, that someone had become me. But I was also realistic. I knew what would happen if my name was removed from all of them at once without a replacement in place. And I knew something else. My employment contract had a clause. If I was terminated without cause, certain credentials that had been maintained under my personal authorization and that the company had paid for my training and certification to obtain would require formal relinquishment. The company's counsel had actually drafted that language originally to protect them from a different scenario. It had, over the years, become something else entirely. I didn't plan any of what happened next. I just knew what was in the contract, and I made sure I understood exactly what I was entitled to do. The termination meeting was on a Wednesday morning in November. My new boss was there, one of the consultants, and an HR representative I'd never spoken to before. It lasted about 20 minutes. He talked about restructuring, evolving compliance needs, and shifting toward a technology-forward approach. He said the company was grateful for my contributions. The HR representative slid a severance packet across the table. 2 weeks per year of service, capped at 24 weeks. Standard Ohio practice. I picked up the packet. I didn't open it. I asked one question. I asked whether the company had identified a qualified replacement for the DEA registered role, the FDA establishment contact, and the Board of Pharmacy qualified person designation before moving forward with this restructuring. There was a pause. My new boss said that the company had plans in place to address the transition. I nodded. I thanked them for the meeting. I signed the separation acknowledgement, not the full severance agreement, just the acknowledgement of the meeting itself. I told the HR representative I'd review the severance agreement and respond within the statutory period. Then I walked back to my office, called my attorney on my cell phone, and spent 45 minutes on the phone while the rest of the building had its Wednesday lunch. The relinquishment process was precise. My attorney and I had reviewed the contract clause twice before the termination. Once when I first realized what was happening. Once the week before the meeting. The language was clear. The credentials that had been tied to my personal authorization, for which I was the named responsible individual with federal or state agencies, required formal action. Over the next 5 business days, I initiated the appropriate notifications. DEA notification of change in registrant status, FDA Establishment Registration Update removing my name as primary contact. Board of Pharmacy Qualified Person Vacancy Notice. EPA Permit Amendment reflecting a change in designated representative. Each one was filed correctly, completely, and with proper advance notice per the applicable regulations. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything malicious. I followed every legal and regulatory requirement exactly as written. The facility's compliance coverage didn't collapse immediately. It started showing gaps. I heard about the first problem from my former coworker who texted me 12 days after my last day. A scheduled FDA pre-announcement inspection review had flagged that the establishment registration showed an unresolved contact update. Nothing catastrophic, yet, but it had triggered a follow-up inquiry. The second problem arrived faster. A DEA compliance audit that had been on the calendar for 6 weeks didn't have a registrant of record to receive the auditors. The facility's legal team spent 3 days on phone calls trying to explain the situation and requesting an extension. DEA granted a short extension but flagged the facility for a follow-up review. The Board of Pharmacy issue was the most operationally disruptive. Without a qualified person on file, the facility technically could not release new batches for distribution under Ohio law. The batches already in the pipeline, including Lot 4471B, the one I'd been reviewing the afternoon I got the email, were frozen pending resolution. I found out later that 4 hospital distribution contracts had shipment delays. 2 clients escalated formally. 1 began exploring alternative suppliers. My new boss, from what I was told, spent about 3 weeks insisting that the legal team find a workaround, that the credentials could be transferred or temporarily assigned, that there must be a bridge solution. There wasn't. Because that's not how federal pharmaceutical regulation works. And if he'd spent 11 minutes actually listening during our first meeting rather than glancing at his laptop, he might have known that. I want to be clear about something. I didn't enjoy watching the facility struggle. I'd spent 19 years in that building. I knew the people on the production floor. I knew the QA technicians who worked nights. I knew the maintenance supervisor who'd been there longer than I had. Real people were dealing with real disruption because of decisions made by a man who had treated compliance as an optimization problem rather than a legal and safety obligation. My coworker called me about 3 weeks in. She told me the consultants had both been quietly reassigned to advisory roles, whatever that meant. She told me that HR was fielding multiple calls a week from the DEA, FDA, and state board. She told me that the replacement search for my former roles had produced exactly 1 qualified candidate who had withdrawn after learning about the ongoing regulatory situation. She also told me that my former new boss had, in a particularly illuminating moment during a staff meeting, asked aloud why all these certifications were in one person's name anyway. A senior chemist in the room had apparently paused, looked at him, and said very quietly, "Because you need a qualified person. That's what qualified person means." I heard that secondhand. But I believe it. My severance negotiation took 6 weeks. My attorney argued that the restructuring had targeted a position whose elimination created foreseeable and substantial regulatory risk, and that the company's failure to conduct adequate succession planning constituted negligence in their duty of care. We didn't pursue litigation, but the final severance agreement was considerably more generous than the initial packet that had been slid across the table at me that Wednesday morning in November. I also negotiated a formal consulting engagement. 6 months, define scope, specific deliverables, assist the replacement candidate through the DEA and FDA registration processes, ensure Board of Pharmacy qualified person designation was restored, provide documentation review for the EPA permit amendment. The rate was higher than my former annual salary, annualized, not by a little. I drove to that first consulting meeting in a car I'd wanted for a long time, a clean 2019 Ford Mustang GT. Dark blue, manual transmission. I'd been telling myself I'd buy it when the timing was right. Turned out the timing became very right, very quickly. Here is what I want people to understand about what happened, because I've been asked about it more than once since. I didn't set a trap. I didn't engineer this outcome. I didn't wake up the morning after my termination with a plan to bring the facility to its knees. What I did was follow the law, honor the terms of my contract, and ensure that 19 years of regulatory work was properly concluded rather than just abandoned. The trap was already there. It had been there for years, quietly embedded in the structure of pharmaceutical regulation, the way federal licensing works. The reason a qualified person means a specific human being with specific credentials, and not a job title you can reassign on a spreadsheet. My new boss didn't build that trap. He just walked into it confidently, without looking down. Companies that operate in highly regulated industries are built on institutional knowledge, not buzzwords, not dashboards, not technology-forward compliance frameworks. They're built on people who spent years learning exactly what the regulations require, exactly where the edges are, exactly what happens when you let something lapse by 30 days, or file a form incorrectly, or terminate the wrong person without a succession plan. Call that legacy overhead if you want. I'll be at my consulting desk answering that question. My coworker left Crestline 4 months after I did. She called me the day she put in her notice, and I told her I wasn't surprised and that she'd made the right call. She's now leading QA at a smaller specialty compounder in Columbus that treats its experienced staff like the operational infrastructure they actually are. She seems happier. The replacement they eventually found for my former role is a pharmacist with regulatory experience who, from what I understand, spent her first month going through files and telling people things I'd told them for years. I don't hold anything against her. She walked into a difficult situation and she's doing the work. The consulting engagement wrapped up on schedule. The facility is functional again. Regulatory standing restored. DEA and FDA relationships repaired as much as those relationships can be repaired after that kind of disruption. My new boss left Crestline about 2 months after the consulting engagement ended. I don't know where he went. I hope, genuinely, that wherever he landed, someone sat him down in a room for longer than 11 minutes and explained what the words qualified person actually mean. I'm writing this from the back porch of the house I own outright now. Paid off the mortgage last year, earlier than I'd planned. The consulting rate made that possible. The Mustang is in the garage. There's a cup of coffee getting cold on the table next to me because I got distracted. I spent 19 years keeping a pharmaceutical facility legally operational. I understood every permit, every renewal, every regulatory relationship that kept that building running and those products moving to the patients who needed them. They called that legacy overhead. I called it my job, and I was very, very good at it. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened at Crestline, not the regulatory pieces. Those are straightforward, honestly. What I keep coming back to is something quieter, something about the choices people make when they think no one's keeping score. My new boss didn't do anything unusual in a certain light. He came into a new role, saw things he didn't understand, and labeled them as problems. That's a pretty human thing to do. What he didn't do, what he never tried to do, was ask. 11 minutes in that first meeting. 11 minutes, and he'd already decided I was furniture he couldn't find a use for. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of character. There's a difference. I think about Frank sometimes, my old director. Frank wasn't brilliant. He wasn't some visionary. He was just a man who understood that he didn't know everything, and that the people who'd been doing the work longer than him probably knew things he didn't. That basic humility kept the facility compliant for years. It kept products moving to hospitals. It kept real patients getting what they needed. Frank never got credit for that. Humility rarely does. What I learned from my 19 years at that facility, and from the strange months that followed my termination, is that competence has a patience to it. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up, keeps the files current, keeps the renewals on schedule, does the work that looks boring from the outside until the moment it stops getting done. And then suddenly everyone understands exactly what it was worth. I didn't set out to prove anything. I set out to follow the law and honor my obligations. The consequences that followed from that weren't something I engineered. They were the natural result of a system built on accountability meeting a leadership team that had never taken accountability seriously. You can call that karma if you want a word for it. I just call it cause and effect. Actions have consequences. Neglect has consequences. Dismissing expertise you don't understand has consequences. These aren't moral judgments. They're just how things work. My coworker, one of the sharpest people I've ever worked with, made her own choice when the time came. She didn't wait to be pushed out. She walked out on her terms, toward something better. That took its own kind of courage, the willingness to leave something familiar because you've stopped being treated like you matter. That's not easy, even when it's right. I respected her for it then. I respect her for it more now. If there's anything I'd want someone to take from Owen's story, it's this. The work you do with integrity accumulates. It doesn't always get recognized in the moment. It doesn't always get rejoined in the obvious ways. But it builds something real, in your record, in your reputation, in your own understanding of what you're capable of. And when the moment comes where that work is suddenly, visibly, undeniably essential, nobody can take credit for it but you. Do the work, know your worth, keep your own records straight. The rest has a way of following.